There was a time when nightfall carried a different kind of silence. Before machines hummed and cities burned with electric light, darkness was thick and alive, woven with whispers and unseen movements. In the narrow streets of medieval Europe, torches flickered like fragile stars, throwing trembling shadows across walls of stone. People spoke softly, not only because the air was cold, but because the world listened. Every sound, every word, was a ripple in a pool of unseen forces, divine, mysterious, and sometimes cruel. Markets opened with the first gray hint of dawn. The air smelled of damp earth and smoke, of bread turning golden in clay ovens. Merchants called out prices, though most buyers already knew them by heart. Everything was ordered, not by reason, but by custom rules passed down through lips and legends. You were born into your place, and your place was not a question. There were lords who owned the land, priests who owned the truth, and peasants who carried both upon their backs. Yet even the powerful trembled, for no one could see the face of God, and still, everyone feared his gaze. In this world, law was not confined to parchment. It lived in the walls of churches, in the toll of bells, in the sudden silence when a stranger walked by. To live rightly was to walk carefully through invisible lines. If your shadow crossed the church threshold at the wrong hour, if you spoke the wrong blessing, if you forgot to bow where others bowed, you might feel eyes upon you. Not human eyes, but something colder, weightless, eternal. The world was not ruled by logic as we know it. It was ruled by the idea that everything seen had an unseen twin, and that twin was always watching. A baker might be punished for selling bread shaped like a cross. A woman could be tried for dreaming too vividly, or for owning a book in a language she couldn't read. There were rules about which shoes to wear on which day, when to smile, how long to mourn, none of it written in the way we understand writing. Instead, it was breathed into being by repetition, by whispers, by the constant fear of standing apart. The laws were not madness. They were the architecture of survival logic, born from a world where danger was everywhere, and protection came only from conformity. Even kings bent to it. They too confessed their sins to priests who claimed to hear God directly. In monasteries, men spent lifetimes copying manuscripts forbidden to be read aloud. In cathedrals, frescoes told stories of heaven and hell so vividly that children cried at the sight. Everything was connected, every stone, every symbol, every silence. It wasn't faith alone that built those cathedrals, it was fear shaped into beauty. To live then was to move through layers of obedience, unseen but unbreakable. People didn't question why a black cat crossing the road meant doom, or why a bell tolling thrice could protect a soul. The laws of heaven and the laws of man were the same, or so they were told. And yet, beneath the calm rhythm of prayer and ritual, a quiet unease hummed. What if the priests were wrong? What if the signs were misread? But doubt was dangerous. Doubt was contagion. So people learned to bury it deep, beneath the rituals that soothed them. Still, even obedience has a limit. There were always those who noticed the cracks, scholars who wondered why God's word changed from one region to another, villagers who saw miracles denied by authority, healers who treated sickness with herbs instead of prayer. These small acts of curiosity were not rebellion, not yet. They were simply sparks in the dark, flashes of another logic trying to be born. But in a world so tightly wound, even a whisper could unravel the whole. The deeper truth was this: those strange laws made sense once. They were not the delusions of fools, but the framework of meaning for a frightened species. When lightning struck a tower, people saw punishment. When crops failed, they saw the hand of sin. In a time when nature spoke louder than reason, belief was protection. The rules were a shield against chaos, and chaos, then, was everywhere. To break a law was not just disobedience, it was to invite the unknown. As centuries turned, those invisible chains began to rust. New minds whispered new ideas, But in the heart of medieval Europe, the old world still pulsed with its strange order. You could walk through a city that looked peaceful, and yet beneath the calm, thousands of unspoken fears kept everything standing. If one thread was pulled, all might collapse. Imagine waking up tomorrow and discovering that the laws you obey, the habits you live by, had vanished. No traffic lights, no currency, no religion. Imagine no one remembering why things were once done. Would you feel free or lost? That is what happened once. A civilization's rules dissolved almost overnight, and the silence that followed was deafening. We call it progress, now the fading of superstition, the birth of reason. But something was lost in that vanishing. For those who lived through it, the change felt like waking from a dream and realizing the world had never been what they thought. And though historians trace the shift through kings and councils, through reformations and revolutions, none can explain how the old laws disappeared so suddenly. Some claim fire destroyed the records. Others whisper that they were erased deliberately, a cleansing of memory too complete to be natural. Whatever the truth, one fact remains. 1,000 years of order vanished, and no one seemed to notice until it was gone. The world before the silence still lingers in forgotten manuscripts, in the shapes carved into church doors, in the stories peasants once told around the fire. The echoes are faint, but they remain. And so we must ask, who made those laws? Who decided what was sacred and what was sin? And why, after shaping centuries of life, were they buried so quietly that even time seems complicit? The answer lies in the hands that wrote them and in the hidden minds that chose to make the world forget. The laws of the old world did not emerge from chaos. They were placed, piece by piece, like stones in a cathedral fitted so perfectly that few ever questioned who built them. Behind the priests and the kings, behind the seals and parchments, there moved a quieter force, a hand that preferred the dark, shaping society not through swords or speeches, but through belief itself. What began as faith became a web of precision, and the world danced upon its threads without knowing it. It was not enough for people to obey. They had to want to obey, to kneel not from fear alone, but from a strange, aching comfort in submission. The church understood this well. It learned that the soul could be ruled more completely than the body if one knew the right stories to tell. Heaven and hell were not merely promises, they were instruments. Through them, rulers governed dreams as easily as deeds. Every rule about what to eat, what to wear, when to pray, carried a deeper rhythm, a pattern so familiar it began to feel like safety. Beneath this order, every object became symbolic. Colors spoke, gestures had weight, silence had meaning. The smallest acts, crossing a threshold, lighting a candle, glancing skyward, were mapped upon invisible grids of permission and sin. The laws themselves were written on parchment, yes, but their truest power lay in what was unwritten, in the expectation that everyone already knew. It was an architecture of thought, designed to sustain obedience not by threat, but by ritual. Consider the rules of dress. The poor were forbidden from wearing certain fabrics, not because of vanity, but because each thread represented one's place in the divine order. Velvet on a peasant was more than a crime, it was a crack in the illusion that heaven had arranged every rank. Speech, too, was bound by unseen chains. To question a priest's sermon was not discourse, it was rebellion against the voice of God. And dreams, even they were watched. A confession could begin with, "Father, I dreamt," and end with penance, for even the mind's wanderings belonged to the church. But what is most curious is how willingly people accepted it. They bowed, not just out of fear, but because obedience felt holy. To live without the structure of law was to drift into spiritual chaos. In that sense, the hidden architects of the Middle Ages achieved something remarkable. They built a world where the human spirit itself became self-policing. The whip was rarely needed, for the conscience did the work. And that was the true brilliance of control. When punishment comes from within, there is no escape. Historians speak of councils, papal decrees, royal mandates, but those were only the surface. Beneath them, secret gatherings whispered of order and purity, of guiding mankind as shepherds guide flocks too restless to see their purpose. They crafted symbols that only the initiated understood. A triangle carved into a monastery door might signify divine hierarchy. A pattern of stars on a tapestry might chart the ranks of power behind the altar. Most people never noticed. And that was the point. The perfection of control is invisibility. To the common eye, it seemed that the world ran on faith. But to those who understood its machinery, it was a system, a carefully tuned mechanism of obedience and reward. The hidden hand wrote in shadows, but its language was everywhere. In the way bells rang, dividing day from prayer, in the rhythm of work and confession, in the guilt that followed joy too freely felt. Such guilt was not natural. It was taught, refined, perfected. The most powerful tool of all was silence. To question was to risk isolation, and in a world built on community, that was a slow kind of death. So people learned to censor themselves long before others could. The very thought of disobedience brought unease, as if unseen eyes waited just beyond the candlelight. And perhaps they did. Monks kept lists of names, those who murmured, those who hesitated to kneel. But not all such records reached the archives. Some were passed hand to hand, sealed in wax and hidden beneath cloisters, carrying orders from voices unknown. It is tempting to call this oppression, but that would be too simple. There was comfort in the design. The poor found purpose in sacrifice, the rich in stewardship. Even suffering made sense when framed as divine testing. The world was painful, yes, but it was coherent, and that coherence was intoxicating. People needed it as much as they feared it. In a strange way, the architects of order gave humanity something it could not give itself. The illusion that everything, every loss, every injustice was part of a plan. And yet, every illusion contains its flaw. The tighter the pattern, the more fragile it becomes. As trade routes expanded, as new lands whispered of other gods and other laws, cracks began to appear. Merchants who traveled to the east returned with tales of people untouched by Christian law and yet prosperous, content, even wise. Questions bloomed quietly in their minds. Could the divine order be local, not universal? Could holiness depend on geography? Such thoughts, once impossible, began to spread like candlelight in a draught. By the late centuries, the Church faced a problem it could not confess. People had begun to see the system itself. The rituals still soothed, but the spell had weakened. Scholars dared to translate texts once deemed forbidden. Alchemists mixed faith with reason, seeking truth not in scripture but in nature. Each discovery loosened a thread from the grand design. The hidden hand that had once guided every act found itself gripping smoke, but the most haunting mystery remains. What happened to the architects themselves? Those who designed the patterns, who wrote the unwritten codes, they vanish from record, as if erased not by time, but by intent. Their manuscripts burned, their symbols chiseled away. It is as though someone, or something, decided that humanity was ready to forget, ready to believe that its freedom had arrived by accident and not by design. Perhaps that was the final act of control, to disappear completely, leaving only the faint aftertaste of obedience. We still feel it now, though we call it by other names: law, morality, common sense. The system evolves, but its spirit remains. We still seek approval. We still fear standing apart. The architecture of order was never destroyed. It was absorbed, rebuilt in subtler forms, hidden beneath the rhythm of modern life. And so the story shifts. For if the old world was ruled by faith and silence, what, then, rules us now? The names have changed, but the structure endures. And as we turn the page of history, one question follows us like a shadow. Who benefits when obedience feels like faith? Beneath the echoing halls of stone, where torches burned in iron brackets and shadows clung to vaulted ceilings, a different kind of power was forged. It did not march with swords or banners, nor did it proclaim itself in markets or sermons. It gathered in silence in chambers few would ever see, where parchment rustled like whispers and decisions were sealed with wax rather than blood. These were the rooms where laws were born. The councils met by candlelight, men in robes heavy with the dust of learning and privilege. Theologians, nobles, and scholars argued not over land or gold, but over the shape of the soul itself. They debated sin as strategy and obedience as architecture. To rule a man's body was simple. To rule his thoughts required invention. And so, law became their most elegant weapon, invisible, unquestionable, wrapped in the authority of God. One scribe described these gatherings as a theater of reason performed for heaven's unseen audience. The phrase lingered through centuries, though no one remembered his name. Each decree was crafted with care. A law against wearing certain colors after dusk, for fear it might tempt envy. A rule forbidding laughter near churches, lest joy offend the solemn. Edicts about the way a loaf of bread must be broken, or the silence required before sunrise. To the commoner, they seemed arbitrary. To the council, they were instruments' notes in a symphony of control. Every command was a test. Who would question? Who would obey without hesitation? Loyalty could be measured not by words, but by compliance. When a man stopped singing after sunset because the priest had declared it sinful, the council knew its reach had grown. When a village altered its festivals to match new decrees, power was confirmed. Control became invisible, and therefore complete. The reasoning behind these laws often came dressed in the language of holiness. Order reflects the divine, one bishop wrote. To defy order is to defy God. But behind those pious words hid human calculation. The nobles sought stability, the church sought unity, and the scholars sought patterns, formulas to bind chaos through behavior. They understood that fear was not enough. Fear fades, habit endures. The true art of domination was to make obedience feel sacred. In one surviving record from the 13th century, a law dictates that no citizen may sleep between the hours of noon and 3 on certain feast days. The reasoning is unclear. Some claim it was to prevent idleness, others to honor the passion hours of Christ. Yet a marginal note, scribbled by an unknown hand, adds another thought. Those who wake at this time speak truths best left unspoken. The comment was later crossed out, but it remains a fragment of unease within a world that demanded silence. In another decree, people were forbidden to touch the metal of their tools after sunset. Blacksmiths, farmers, masons, all told to let iron rest as night fell. The explanation cited the souls of labor, but perhaps it was something else. Perhaps those in power feared what men might build in the dark when no one watched. These strange restrictions shaped daily rhythms, turning life into ritual and ritual into submission. Not every law was meant to last. Some were designed to appear and vanish, like dreams. Temporary rules kept people uncertain, ensuring constant adjustment. Predictability breeds confidence. Confusion breeds obedience. A villager might wake to find yesterday's customs suddenly forbidden, and so he learned not to trust himself, only the voice of authority. It was a delicate balance. Too much cruelty would break the system, too little would loosen it. The architects of law walked that line like tightrope dancers over an abyss. Enforcement came not from armies, but from eyes. Every household became its own warden. Mothers corrected children, neighbors whispered. Priests listened at confessions for signs of disloyalty disguised as sin. Punishment was rare because it wasn't needed. Fear of exclusion was punishment enough. In a world where belonging meant survival, even suspicion could ruin a life. Thus, the councils ruled not by decree alone, but by the quiet complicity of the people themselves. Sometimes, however, questions slipped through. A scholar might notice contradictions, two edicts clashing, two truths overlapping. What then? In such cases, another council convened, not to correct the error, but to reinterpret it. Ambiguity was useful. It reminded the faithful that understanding was not their burden. "The law is divine mystery," said a famous abbot. "To comprehend it fully is to sin." In that way, even confusion became a tool of control. There are stories, half legend, half record, of dissenting voices silenced in peculiar ways. A philosopher in Paris who argued that laughter was natural and therefore holy vanished after publishing his treatise. A priest who suggested that certain decrees conflicted with Scripture was reassigned to a monastery in the Alps, where he froze before spring thawed the roads. Officially, both men died of melancholy. Unofficially, they died of curiosity. And yet, for all their authority, the councils feared one thing: that their logic might one day be seen for what it was, human invention dressed as eternal truth. The laws they wrote were mirrors reflecting their own anxieties. They feared chaos, temptation, rebellion, and above all, freedom. Each decree was an attempt to tame the human spirit into predictability, to bind it within ritual so that nothing unpredictable could emerge. But control has a cost. Over time, the weight of countless rules began to suffocate those who enforced them. Scribes questioned the purpose of rewriting the same decrees. Priests sensed fatigue among their congregations. Obedience turned mechanical, hollow. The more precise the control, the more fragile it became. One misstep, one spark of disobedience, and the illusion of divine order could shatter. Some whispered that even within the councils, doubt had begun to spread. Younger members questioned the need for laws that no longer served clear purpose. If all behavior is ruled, one is said to have asked, when does the soul choose? The question was recorded, then struck through with black ink. Perhaps he, too, disappeared soon after. Still, the machine continued, laws written, copied, proclaimed, forgotten. Each generation inherited the codes without memory of why they were made. And as centuries passed, the origin of those strange decrees faded into legend. They became part of the landscape, as natural as mountains or the moon. The people followed them not from belief, but from habit, which is a deeper form of faith. But nothing built in shadow stays untouched by light forever. When the laws grew too heavy to bear, when even the faithful began to forget their meaning, small tremors began beneath the surface of obedience. Somewhere in the silence, someone started to ask why. And that single question, quiet, fragile, dangerous, would become the first crack in the stone walls of certainty. It began not with fire or uprising, but with a whisper. The same quiet breath that once carried obedience began to carry doubt. In the stillness of monasteries and the dim corners of scriptoria, a subtle unease stirred, not loud enough to be called defiance, but alive enough to spread. A monk paused mid-sentence, his quill hovering above the parchment, realizing he no longer believed the words he copied. A merchant broke a curfew, not from greed or recklessness, but to feel, for a single forbidden moment, what freedom might taste like. These were not revolutionaries. They were sleepers, slowly waking. The first acts of rebellion were invisible. A scholar inserted a small mark in the margin of a decree, a symbol that meant false. A nun rewrote a prayer to include the word if, as though testing heaven's patience. Somewhere, an apprentice blacksmith hammered a cross into the underside of a tool, unseen by his master, believing the gesture would protect him from laws he did not understand. Each act was small, but each was a spark in the same dark room. The councils had designed a world where everything had meaning, yet now meaning itself began to slip through their fingers. People obeyed outwardly but drifted inwardly. They performed rituals with hollow eyes, murmured prayers without faith. The structure remained intact, but the spirit within it faltered. To the rulers, the world still seemed orderly. To the ruled, the silence had become unbearable. The most dangerous rebellions are the ones without banners. They move like smoke, formless, impossible to grasp. This one crept through classrooms, taverns, and cloisters alike. Questions appeared in places they shouldn't. A teacher asked why certain feast days changed without reason. A traveler returned from foreign lands speaking of customs unbound by such heavy rules. His stories carried a quiet poison, the suggestion that another life was possible. There were those who sought answers in forbidden texts, manuscripts hidden behind false walls or buried beneath chapel floors. These books contained the earlier laws, the ones erased and replaced. Some were fragments, others whole. They spoke of balance instead of fear, of order built from understanding rather than submission. Reading them was treason, yet in every age, someone always reads. Punishments grew sharper. Not public executions, those were too crude, but disappearances, silences, erasures. A name scratched out from records. A room emptied of possessions. A chair removed from the refectory as though the person had never existed. Fear returned, but now it worked differently. It no longer bred obedience. It bred resentment. People began to realize that even silence could be resistance, a refusal to echo the words of power. Among the quiet rebels were mystics, men and women who saw the divine, not in decrees but in the living world. They spoke of light hidden within every soul, of truth that needed no law to exist. Their language was dangerous because it was simple. If the divine could be found within, then no council could claim ownership of salvation. Some called these mystics heretics, others saints. History could never decide. There's a story of one such wanderer, a nameless figure said to have walked from village to village carrying only a lantern and a book without words. He spoke to no one. Yet where he passed, people began questioning the rules they'd followed all their lives. No one ever found him. Some said he was an angel, others a madman. Perhaps he was merely a mirror reflecting what people already felt but feared to admit. As more began to think freely, cracks appeared in the edifice of control. Priests noticed fewer confessions. Markets grew noisy after curfew. Children laughed near churches again. Each act small, each one sacred. The councils responded with more decrees, more sermons about obedience and sin, but the louder they spoke, the less they were heard. The people had learned a subtle truth. The power of any law lies in belief, and belief cannot be commanded. In the heart of this quiet rebellion, art began to change. Music softened. Its melodies curved away from rigid hymns into something freer, something human. Painters hid secret meanings in their frescoes, hands positioned in defiance, halos slightly askew. Even architecture shifted. Cathedrals grew lighter, their windows wider, as if stone itself wanted to breathe. What had begun as rebellion became renewal, invisible yet unstoppable. The rulers sensed danger not in armies but in imagination. They could not punish thought, but they could erase it. Scribes received orders to revise, to simplify, to correct. Whole chapters of chronicles were rewritten. Old decrees vanished from record, and their creators' names followed them into oblivion. Memory itself became a battlefield. To remember was to resist. To forget was to survive. And yet, the more they tried to erase, the more the erased things lingered. Rumors persisted. Some said the missing laws contained knowledge of balance between worlds, not just moral law, but cosmic law. Others whispered that the councils had learned something terrifying, that controlling thought could alter reality itself. Whether myth or metaphor, the idea spread, and like all powerful ideas, it could not be undone. In time, the rebellion became less about defiance and more about awareness. People no longer needed to act out their disobedience. It was enough to see through the illusion. When a priest preached about divine obedience, some eyes remained calm, unpersuaded. When the bells rang to signal curfew, a few stayed outside, gazing at the stars as if remembering something older than any rule. The world had begun to awaken from its long, crafted dream. Still, rebellion has its cost. For every thinker who questioned, there were those who vanished without trace. Their writings were burned, their symbols scraped from walls. But fragments survived ink stains hidden beneath newer layers, marginal notes too faint to erase. Future generations would find them and wonder what story had been buried beneath the official one. By the century's end, the councils faced a strange paradox. They had achieved near-perfect order, yet the spirit that gave meaning to that order was gone. The laws were still read, still obeyed, but without faith. The system had hollowed itself out, like a cathedral whose bells ring over an empty town. The silence that followed was not peace, it was exhaustion. In that exhaustion lay possibility. When structures crumble, the dust reveals what once stood beneath them. Among the ruins of blind obedience, something fragile began to glow, the human will to understand rather than to submit. History would later call it reason, but at its birth it was nothing more than wonder rediscovered. As the last of the medieval lawmakers died, their parchment decrees curling into dust beside them, the next generation faced a world both liberated and lost. Many of the old laws were quietly abandoned, others deliberately erased. But even erasure leaves an outline, a ghost of what once was. In the forgotten monasteries where rebellion had first stirred, the ink from censored pages bled through to the next. Layer upon layer, the past refused to stay buried. And somewhere, in the stillness of that hidden history, new questions waited. Questions about memory, control, and the strange power of disappearance. The silence that ended the rebellion was not the end at all. It was the pause before revelation, the hush before the erased laws began to resurface once more. It happened quietly, without trumpet or rebellion, as though the world had decided to erase a thought mid-sentence. One dawn in the middle of the 14th century, scribes opened their ledgers to find entire pages missing, not torn but absent, as if the ink itself had repented. The laws that had governed daily life for generations were simply gone. No royal decree, no church proclamation, no fires in the street. Only silence, deep and absolute. For centuries, men had lived by codes etched into memory and parchment alike. How to speak to one's betters, which colors to wear on holy days, how many candles to burn for the dead. These were the rhythms of existence, the unseen scaffolding that held society upright. Yet on that morning, confusion spread like fog. Clerks searched archives, priests rummaged through scrolls, magistrates demanded explanations. None came. The decrees had evaporated, leaving only gaps neat as if carefully trimmed by an invisible hand. Historians would later call it a correction, a reform of faith or politics. But those who lived through it described something stranger. It was as though memory itself had been rewritten, wrote a monk from Rouen. We knew the rules had changed, yet could not recall what the old ones were. Families argued over customs that no longer existed. Some insisted the laws forbidding laughter on fasting days were still valid. Others swore such decrees had never been real. Collective memory fractured, and with it, certainty. Within monasteries, the panic was worse. Scribes were summoned before their abbots and told to amend every surviving codex to bring the texts in line with divine reason. The order sounded routine, yet its tone carried dread. No one knew who had issued it, or why. Each monastery received the same instruction, written in identical hand, delivered by messengers who never gave their names. The scribes obeyed. By lamplight, they scraped ink from vellum, washing away sentences that had stood for centuries. Whole paragraphs vanished beneath thin veils of new writing, faint ghosts beneath the surface. To the monks, it felt like murder. Words were sacred. To destroy them was to unmake truth. Some trembled as they worked, others whispered prayers. A few refused and disappeared soon after. Their absence was noted only in marginalia. Brother Anselm excused from duty. No further record, nothing more. Outside the cloisters, people sensed the change, though they could not name it. Markets grew uneasy. Tradesmen asked if the old taxes still applied. Judges hesitated before sentencing thieves. The very idea of right and wrong began to blur. In villages, rumor replaced law. One hamlet claimed the church had lifted all tithes. Another believed blasphemy no longer carried punishment. Chaos did not erupt, it seeped, slow and invisible, like water under a locked door. Scholars have offered many explanations. Some blame politics, rival powers reshaping the moral order to strengthen control. Others see the church's hand, cleansing contradictions from centuries of accumulated doctrine. A few speak of darker motives, a secret council attempting to conceal forbidden knowledge that had slipped too close to revelation. Whatever the reason, the effect was the same, a world edited in silence. There are chronicles describing that season as a quiet apocalypse. Crops still grew, bells still rang, yet something essential had died. People walked through familiar streets that no longer felt real, as if time itself had been rearranged. One chronicler compared it to waking in a house whose rooms had shifted overnight. "You know the walls are wrong," he wrote, "but you cannot say why." What vanished was not only the text, but the trust that text provided. Without written certainty, truth reverted to rumor, and rumor to faith. The authority that had once radiated from parchment now flickered like candlelight, alive but unstable. In this new uncertainty, whispers of conspiracy took root. Some claimed angels had descended to erase the blasphemies of men. Others, that demons had done the same to conceal a greater sin. Both explanations felt safer than admitting ignorance. Among the few surviving letters from that year, one stands apart. A friar named Thomas wrote to his superior, "I dream each night that the words I erase return upon the page in another tongue. When I wake, the parchment is clean, but I feel watched." His letter ends abruptly. The next day's entry in the monastery ledger notes that Brother Thomas departed on pilgrimage, though no route is listed. Even the governing powers seemed reluctant to speak of the event. Royal records skip whole months. Chroniclers insert deliberate blanks, and sermons from that period strike a nervous tone, reassuring the faithful that divine law remains eternal, even as human law fades. It is as though everyone agreed to forget at once, as though forgetting was the only way to survive whatever had occurred. Centuries later, researchers piecing together remnants from monasteries in France, Italy, and Bohemia noticed the same pattern: pages washed clean, rewritten with neutral proclamations about virtue and humility, never about specific behavior. The texture of control had changed. Instead of prescribing every act, the new codes appealed to conscience, leaving interpretation to authority figures. Obedience became personal, internalized. Perhaps that was the true purpose of the purge, to shift the chains from parchment to the human mind. Yet the mystery endures. No single document explains who ordered the erasure. No decree survives to mark the change. In archives across Europe, one can still find folios with faint, ghostly impressions beneath later ink lines too shallow to read, too stubborn to vanish. Under ultraviolet light, they form patterns, recurring phrases, half-sentences about the unseen covenant and the balance of the days. What these meant, no one knows. Imagine waking to discover that centuries of rules, punishments, and protections had simply dissolved. Yet life went on as if nothing had changed. People still prayed, still paid dues, still feared sin, though no one could define it anymore. That was the true miracle of the erasure, not destruction, but replacement. The world continued, unaware it had been rewritten. And so history turned a silent corner. The scribes finished their work, stacked the corrected volumes, and locked them away. Dust settled, voices quieted. A new normal emerged, smoother, emptier, easier to control. Over generations, the memory faded, until only a handful of scholars suspected that anything had been lost at all. But absence leaves its own echo. In the faint scratches beneath rewritten laws, in the odd omissions of old sermons, a different story hums a warning or a confession, perhaps both. Some who study these traces claim to hear rhythm in the gaps, as if the missing words still breathe beneath the surface, waiting to be spoken again. For now, they remain buried, sealed beneath layers of piety and fear. Yet history has a way of remembering what it tries hardest to forget. And in the centuries that followed, fragments would begin to reappear, small, stubborn clues refusing to stay silent, calling the curious back toward the mystery of what had truly been erased. In the centuries that followed the erasures, the world learned to live without its lost commandments. Yet the past, like old ink beneath new writing, never truly disappears. Every archive holds its ghosts. And so, scattered across monasteries and forgotten libraries, fragments began to surface, small pieces of parchment that refused oblivion. They were never found all at once. A friar cleaning a reliquary in Burgundy discovered one folded into the lining of a chalice case. Another turned up inside the spine of a devotional book, stitched there like a heartbeat. Each bore only a few words, but they hummed with a strange authority. The day that must not exist, the meal forbidden to remember, law of the unseen doors. Phrases that seemed poetic until one considered their context, legal fragments, not prayers. Someone had wanted them hidden, not lost. Scholars who examined the pieces noticed peculiar consistencies. The handwriting differed, yet the phrasing echoed the same rhythm, as if dictated by one voice through many hands. Most were written in a mixture of Latin and a dialect now extinct, with syntax suggesting deliberate ambiguity. A law might begin with, "Let none observe the third dusk," leaving interpreters to wonder what "observe" or "third dusk" truly meant. These were not careless errors, they were veils. Language had been woven to conceal rather than reveal. As researchers translated what they could, patterns emerged. Many fragments referred to invisible boundaries, times of day, or states of being that ordinary people were forbidden to notice. One text mentioned hours between heartbeats. Another forbade songs that awaken the sleeping ground. Such phrases unsettled even seasoned historians. Were these metaphors or descriptions of phenomena long forgotten? The deeper they read, the less certain they became. Some fragments hinted at cosmic logic rather than civic order. A surviving page from Prague spoke of aligning the realm of flesh to the realm of shadow, warning that imbalance would invite return. Another, preserved beneath wax in a monastery in York, outlined 3 pillars of remembrance, though the second pillar had been scratched out with deliberate violence. The remaining line reads, "Forget, and the gate remains closed." These were not the instructions of mere governance. They felt closer to safeguards. It was as if the vanished laws had been written to protect, not restrict, to keep humanity from touching something too vast, too dangerous to name. Perhaps the lawmakers of old had stumbled upon forces beyond theology and sought to contain them through ritual behavior. If so, erasing those laws might have opened the cage they once maintained. One modern archivist described holding a fragment under lamplight and feeling the hairs rise on his arms. The ink had long browned to dust, yet the words seemed alive, pulsing faintly through the fiber. He swore he heard a low hum, like a voice beneath the threshold of hearing. When he looked again, the parchment was silent. He never spoke of it publicly, only noting in his catalog, "Possible chemical resonance unverified." Those who read the note years later sensed hesitation between the lines, the mark of a man afraid of his own observation. The Church's reaction to these rediscoveries was cautious. Officially, the fragments were deemed curiosities of uncertain origin. Unofficially, many were confiscated within days of announcement. Some historians noticed that every monastery that reported a fragment soon issued a letter claiming the find was misinterpreted. The letters bore identical phrasing, as if composed by one unseen author. Once again, silence covered discovery like snow. Still, copies had already been made. In academic circles, whispers began. What if these scraps were remnants of a system of knowledge too complex for its age? Perhaps those medieval laws, strange as they sounded, were encoded methods for maintaining psychological or even physical balance, a forgotten science cloaked in religion. The idea was dismissed publicly, yet privately it haunted researchers. They spoke of correlations between lunar cycles, architecture, and human emotion, all hinted at in the texts. Could the old world have known more than it could safely admit? Among the most puzzling pieces is a short directive, only 12 words long. When the world forgets the sound, walk backward through the silence. No translation changes its rhythm. Linguists agree the phrasing is deliberate, a kind of riddle. Some see poetry, others prophecy. To those who have spent long nights studying the fragments, the line feels like instruction, an invitation, or perhaps a warning from minds that foresaw amnesia as destiny. The fragments share another peculiarity. None mention rulers, priests, or punishment. They speak only of balance, memory, and return. The tone suggests guardianship rather than domination. It is tempting to imagine an earlier age, one where law and knowledge were intertwined, where obedience meant harmony with the unseen instead of submission to authority. If such an age existed, its extinction would mark not progress but forgetfulness. What frightened later generations enough to erase it? Perhaps these laws hinted that reality itself was participatory, that human behavior, ritual, and attention helped sustain the fabric of the world. To question or neglect them might have risked unraveling something essential. If the councils of control in later centuries discovered this origin, no wonder they buried it. Power built on fear cannot survive knowledge that makes every soul a co-creator. As the fragments circulate among collectors and secret archives, their influence seeps subtly into modern thought. Artists incorporate their phrases into paintings. Musicians hide their cadences in melodies. The past, it seems, is not content to stay buried. Each rediscovery feels like the tapping of fingers on the lid of a long-sealed tomb. Scholars sense that the collection, incomplete though it is, might form a pattern, perhaps a map, perhaps a sequence meant to be reassembled. Yet caution lingers. One historian who attempted to catalog all known fragments fell ill soon after finishing his index. Before he died, he told a colleague, "It isn't history we're reading, it's instruction." No one has found the index since. Today, those who seek the fragments speak in low tones. They trade copies hidden in the margins of unrelated studies, disguised as footnotes or typographical errors. The original parchments remain locked in climate-controlled vaults, or so the institutions claim. But every few years, another appears in a private collection, an auction house, a monastery that swears it never owned one. The pattern continues, like a pulse beneath the centuries. Taken together, the surviving words form not a complete law but a feeling, a hum at the edge of comprehension. They suggest that the erased codes were less about prohibition and more about preservation, as though their authors understood that knowledge, once spoken too clearly, begins to fade. To protect a truth, one must sometimes hide it inside silence. And so, the question remains, suspended like dust in candlelight. Were these forgotten laws the relics of superstition, or the remnants of something that once kept the world in delicate balance? If they were warnings, what danger had they foreseen, and has it already begun to return? Among the whispers that survived the great erasures, one name returns again and again, the Codex of Shadows. Few claim to have seen it, fewer still to have read beyond a page. It was said to be the only manuscript that escaped the purge unaltered, containing the original laws in their true form, the unrevised codes of an age that understood too much. To some, it was legend. To others, a key that unlocked the machinery of human control. The first record of the Codex appears in a letter dated 1000 421, written by a Dominican scholar named Mateo de Arundel. He describes a volume found beneath the ruins of a monastic archive near the River Po. The letter trembles between awe and fear. It is bound in a skin too soft for calf, inked in no language I know. Yet the diagrams within align with constellations unseen in our age. 2 weeks after writing this, Mateo vanished. The letter remains, folded inside another book, a warning disguised as correspondence. Over the next centuries, rumors of the Codex spread like smoke through Europe's hidden corridors of scholarship. In each telling, its contents changed slightly, as though the text itself evolved in the retelling. Some said it held maps of vanished continents, others, instructions for aligning human consciousness with the turning of the heavens. But one theme remained constant. It contained laws for the preservation of memory, rules not of nations, but of existence itself. Monks spoke of a library once housed in the Pyrenees, carved into the mountainside and reachable only by rope bridges and faith. There, they said, copies of forbidden manuscripts were guarded not by soldiers, but by silence. When the Inquisition's fires swept across the land, the mountain library burned for 3 days. Witnesses swore that the flames turned green, and that the smoke carried no smell of ash, only the faint scent of iron and rain. Some believe the Codex perished there. Others claim it was carried away the night before, sealed in a black case lined with symbols older than Latin. Every few generations, a new account surfaces: a traveler's journal, a scholar's confession, a single line in an inventory of seized books. One volume without title, contents unknown, retained for private study. In every case, the possession of the Codex ends in disappearance or disgrace. Professors lose their positions, patrons retract funding, names are struck from registers. The book seems to erase not only history but those who try to reveal it. Those few who dared describe its contents agree on certain details. The text is said to begin with a statement both simple and terrifying. All law is remembrance. Beneath those words lies a sequence of symbols, geometric forms, spiraling inward, each layer intersecting at points corresponding to the movements of celestial bodies. To read the diagrams, it is said, is to experience time not as line but circle, to glimpse how civilizations rise and fall in the same repeating pattern, each cycle triggered by the forgetting of the last. The Codex also speaks of celestial warnings, alignments in the heavens that signal the erosion of human memory. According to one interpretation, when these signs appear, humanity begins to rewrite its own history, deleting truths that threaten its illusions. The laws of the Codex were meant to prevent this. Rituals of recollection, ways to anchor truth before it slipped into myth. But when those laws were erased, the forgetting began anew. No scholar has ever produced a complete translation. The few fragments recorded in private notes read more like prophecy than instruction. One phrase recurs: guard the silence between. Between what? None can say. Some interpret it as the pause between generations, others as the space between thought and action. Whatever its meaning, those who ponder it too deeply often withdraw from the world, claiming to hear a faint hum beneath ordinary sound as if something vast is listening back. In 1679, a Jesuit astronomer named Father Corval wrote that he had glimpsed part of the Codex while visiting a noble's collection in Prague. He describes pages shimmering under candlelight, words shifting when read aloud. He claimed the book contained a diagram predicting a future era when laws shall be digital and obedience invisible. The Church dismissed his statement as allegory. Months later, Corval was found dead in his observatory, surrounded by shattered lenses, his final chart drawn in circles rather than stars. The Codex has since become the ghost of every archive, the text that cannot be found yet influences everything. Some say it still moves between hands, passed in secret auctions, or locked inside private collections of families whose wealth stretches back to the Crusades. Others believe it was never a book at all, but an idea, a pattern carried from mind to mind, surviving where paper cannot. If so, perhaps the Codex has never left us. Perhaps we live by its unseen laws even now. In the 20th century, a historian named Elise Laurent devoted her life to tracing the manuscript's trail. She followed rumors from Italy to Egypt, decoding marginalia in forgotten treatises, until she concluded that the Codex was not written by one author but by many, each civilization adding its own layer of warning. She disappeared in 1964 while visiting a private archive in Geneva. Her final note reads, "The book is awake." The phrase lingers. What does it mean for a book to wake? Perhaps it means that its ideas have escaped confinement, that humanity has rediscovered the same mechanisms of control once described in its pages. The Codex warned of cycles, the rise of order, the tightening of law, the erasure of memory, the rebirth of obedience. When we build new systems to manage behavior, we are unknowingly rewriting the same chapters. The laws change shape, but the structure endures. If one were to believe the Codex still exists, hidden somewhere beyond reach, its message would not be one of despair, but of recognition. It reminds us that forgetting is not loss, but design, that each age erases what it cannot bear to remember. Somewhere, perhaps in a vault beneath a monastery or an archive misfiled under the wrong century, the Codex of Shadows waits. Its pages do not age, its words do not fade, and if its warnings are true, it may soon be needed again. If the Codex of Shadows was indeed real, it may not have been the beginning of forbidden knowledge, but its latest echo. Each civilization, it seems, inherits fragments of the same unseen order, a melody played on different instruments across time. The more scholars compared the erased medieval codes with older systems, the clearer the pattern became. Humanity has always built its reality on repetition, rewriting the same ancient laws under new names. In the clay of Sumeria, beneath the dust of temples long turned to sand, archaeologists uncovered tablets etched with the first recorded laws of mankind. They called them codes of justice, yet their language carried a different weight. One line reads, "Let no man change the measure of the day." Another, "Let the tongue be bridled after dusk, for words have power beyond hearing." These phrases sound less judicial than metaphysical, as if their authors feared not chaos, but awakening. Even then, humanity understood that words shape reality, and silence preserves it. Farther west, the Egyptians carved their own commandments into the walls of stone sanctuaries. They spoke of Ma'at, the balance between truth, order, and cosmic harmony. The priests guarded its mysteries, claiming that when balance was broken, the Nile itself withdrew in protest. One inscription warns, "Forgetfulness is the shadow of sin." Another, older still, describes the days of disremembering, when mankind once forgot the laws of heaven and suffered a long night of confusion. The hieroglyph for that night is the same symbol later used in medieval manuscripts to represent erasure. In Babylon, King Hammurabi's stele stands like a black mirror to the past. Scholars have long praised its clarity, its measured logic, but beneath the surface lies something stranger. The punishments inscribed there seem less about justice and more about resonance, as if each crime disrupted a cosmic chord. To strike another man was not merely violence, but dissonance, a disturbance in the divine rhythm. The law's purpose was to restore harmony, to realign reality itself. Even the phrase, "an eye for an eye," reads differently when seen not as revenge but recalibration, a symmetry of fate rather than fury. And yet, over the centuries, each civilization forgot the reason behind its own order. Ritual became rule, rule became law, and law became habit. The original intent to maintain balance with the unseen turned into a hierarchy of control. When the memory of why a law existed faded, obedience remained, hollow and absolute. This pattern repeats like an echo through millennia. Creation, understanding, corruption, and amnesia. Scholars who study the fragments of ancient codes note uncanny similarities. The Sumerians warned against speaking in darkness. Medieval Europe forbade whistling after sunset. Egypt banned calling the name of the dead under the new moon. Babylon punished those who opened sealed doors at dawn. Across cultures, the same prohibitions appear, clothed in different tongues. It is as if every age inherits the same script, each line translated through fear and ritual. But how could such continuity exist across civilizations separated by oceans and centuries? Some historians attribute it to coincidence, others to archetypal psychology, humanity's universal need to impose order on chaos. Yet a few, studying the symbols in detail, notice something deeper. The geometry of sacred seals, the proportions of temples, the rhythm of chants, all mirror the same ratios found in celestial motion. The ancients did not merely imitate the heavens, they synchronized with them. Their laws were instruments tuned to cosmic order. When they fell out of tune, destruction followed. Consider the myth of Atlantis, a civilization punished not for war but for forgetting its balance. Plato wrote that they had everything, yet remembered nothing. Their fall, he said, came not from arrogance but from amnesia. In the ruins of Egypt and Sumer, the same warning reappears. When memory dies, the world resets. Perhaps this is metaphor. Or perhaps it describes a pattern of erasure older than history, the periodic cleansing of humanity's memory to preserve equilibrium. In this light, the medieval purges no longer seem unique. They were simply another cycle of forgetting, another turning of the great wheel. The Codex of Shadows may have recorded this cycle, explaining how to anchor collective memory before the reset. And if those instructions threatened the rhythm of control, erasing them would have been essential. A civilization cannot question its own illusion and survive it intact. Modern scholars, cautious yet curious, have begun overlaying ancient star maps onto medieval architectural plans. The alignments are impossible to dismiss. Cathedrals, ziggurats, pyramids, even standing stones all point toward the same celestial intersections, recurring every few thousand years. Perhaps these structures were not built for worship but for calibration, grounding humanity to memory through geometry and light. The laws carved into stone, the rituals of obedience, the sacred hours, all were reminders to stay aligned. What, then, are our modern laws? We tell ourselves they are rational, secular, the product of progress. Yet they too govern behavior in invisible ways. They define when to speak, what to reveal, how to conform. They decide which truths are archived and which are erased. If ancient laws managed the harmony between man and cosmos, perhaps ours manage the harmony between man and system, the new order of data and control. The pattern endures, unseen but alive. In this sense, the Codex's influence persists, even without its pages. Its warning about cycles and forgetting resonates with eerie precision. The ancients feared imbalance between heaven and earth. We fear imbalance between truth and convenience. They built monuments to anchor memory. We build networks to contain it. And like them, we trust the permanence of what can vanish overnight. The continuity between Sumerian tablets, Egyptian hymns, Babylonian edicts, and medieval decrees cannot be dismissed as chance. Something or someone ensured that the same invisible architecture of control re-emerged each time the old one fell. Whether it was divine guardianship, cultural inheritance, or a long lineage of unseen custodians, the result is the same. A chain unbroken across time, binding civilizations through the management of memory. In the end, the pattern itself becomes the message. Every empire, no matter its language or creed, begins with discovery and ends with revision. Every era believes it is free while living within inherited rules. The hand that writes those rules may change, but the ink, the will to control what must be remembered and what must be forgotten, remains eternal. And perhaps that is the final echo, that the laws of the past were never truly lost, only rewritten in a modern tongue. We call them principles, rights, or codes of conduct. But beneath the names beats the same pulse, the rhythm of obedience disguised as order. The ancient architects of control have not vanished. They have simply adapted, leaving us to wonder whether the present is merely another chapter of an endless codex still being written. When the laws vanished from parchment, they did not vanish from the world. They simply changed form. What could no longer be written or spoken was carved into stone, sung in chants, or encoded in ritual. Out of the ashes of erased decrees rose those who would guard what could not safely exist in words, the keepers of the hidden law. They called themselves by many names. To the church, they were heretics. To monarchs, they were threats. To history, they are ghosts. But in the quiet corridors of monastic life, among orders sworn to silence and devotion, traces of their existence still linger, small anomalies that reveal an unbroken chain of secret preservation. The Benedictines were among the first to suspect that knowledge could survive only if disguised. Their abbeys, built according to sacred geometry, concealed more than devotion. Within the rhythm of their prayers lay mathematical patterns mirroring celestial cycles. The hours of worship were timed not only to honor God, but to anchor memory to movement, a human clock synchronizing with the heavens. To those who listened without understanding, it was routine. To those initiated, it was the code of continuity. Later came the Knights Templar, warriors in white mantles marked with the Red Cross. Officially, they were protectors of pilgrims. Unofficially, they were protectors of something older, the remnants of the erased law. Chroniclers whisper that during their campaigns in the East, the Templars uncovered ancient scrolls beneath the ruins of Solomon's temple. Some said it was the codex itself. Others, fragments of the earlier codes upon which it was based. Whatever they found changed them. They returned not only richer but wiser and infinitely more dangerous to those who ruled by ignorance. Their symbols began appearing across Europe. Twin riders on a single horse, circles within squares, crosses formed by intersecting arcs. To the uninitiated, decoration. To the initiated, instruction. Each mark was a lesson disguised as faith, a reminder that power must bend to balance, that memory, once lost, can be restored through form. The Templars' fortresses reflected the same geometry as ancient ziggurats and Egyptian sanctuaries, as if architecture itself had become scripture. When the church turned against them, accusing them of heresy and idolatry, it was not because of greed or politics, as historians claim. It was because they had remembered too much. Their initiation rites spoke of a light beyond the altar, a knowledge that no pope or king could control. On the night before their suppression, witnesses reported that the Templar treasurers in Paris emptied their vaults and vanished. What they carried has never been found. Perhaps it was gold. Perhaps it was something far more valuable, the unbroken lineage of forbidden memory. Other, quieter groups followed the Cathars, the Rosicrucians, the Cistercians, who practiced a discipline of silence so precise that their architecture seemed to speak for them. In every generation, someone kept the thread alive, preserving what could not be publicly taught. The law, once erased from text, lived on as pattern, proportion, and symbol. Even the design of the great cathedrals bears their signature. The rose windows of Chartres and Notre Dame are not merely stained glass. They are maps of resonance, translating divine order into light and color. Their circles mirror the orbital paths of planets known and unknown. Each column, each arch, follows mathematical ratios echoing the hidden laws of harmony, laws the ancients once inscribed on clay, later reimagined in stone. To the faithful, these cathedrals were houses of worship. To the keepers, they were vaults of remembrance. The monastic reformers understood that architecture could outlive persecution. Stone does not burn as easily as parchment. When the Inquisition confiscated manuscripts, it could not confiscate geometry. And so, knowledge went underground, literally and symbolically embedded within the very bones of Europe. Bridges, cloisters, chapels, even wells followed secret alignments, tracing patterns visible only from above, as if the earth itself had been turned into a manuscript. Every century or so, the keepers resurfaced in new forms, adopting new symbols to match the language of their age. In the Renaissance, they appeared as guilds of architects and stonemasons, claiming inspiration from divine geometry. To the world, they built monuments. To themselves, they were writing history in the only medium that remained safe. Their emblem, the compass and square, was no mere tool of craft, but a declaration that creation and law are one, that true order cannot be written but must be built. Those who studied their designs noticed impossible consistencies. Cathedrals separated by hundreds of miles shared identical mathematical proportions, as though drafted by a single hand. Even their decorations carried hidden correspondences. Patterns of flowers with precisely 6 petals, stairs built in sequences of sacred numbers, windows shaped like keyholes to other worlds. These were not coincidences. They were instructions. Rumors grew that within the secret councils of these builders lay fragments of the Codex of Shadows itself, not in words, but in measures and stone weights. A single miscalculated angle could disrupt the energy of a whole structure, changing how sound moved through it, how light fell. The builders said the cathedrals could sing. Modern acousticians agree their resonant frequencies align with human heartbeat patterns. Coincidence or intention? Perhaps both. But secrecy has a cost. Many of the keepers paid for their guardianship with exile or death. Some were burned as sorcerers, others silenced under oaths that turned into prisons of loyalty. Yet the knowledge endured, surviving not in any one order but through the persistence of design itself. The laws, hidden beneath art and ritual, became invisible to those who no longer looked for meaning. And that may have been the point. The ultimate disguise for forbidden knowledge is normality. When the extraordinary becomes ordinary, it ceases to draw suspicion. The keepers succeeded not by revealing truth, but by hiding it in plain sight in the alignment of doorways, the rhythm of bells, the ratio of towers to courtyards. Today, tourists walk beneath these arches, photographing beauty without seeing intention. They marvel at symmetry without realizing it is scripture. But for those who know how to read the stone, the message remains clear. Nothing was lost, only transformed. The erased laws still stand around us, written in architecture, waiting for those with patience to listen. And as the centuries turned, those who inherited this secret art continued to refine it, embedding their memory deeper into form until the buildings themselves began to whisper again, reminding the world that silence is never truly empty. At first glance, the cathedrals of Europe appear merely beautiful monuments to faith, to ambition, to the human longing for height. Yet beneath the ornament and devotion lies something older than religion and quieter than stone. The builders who shaped these places were not only craftsmen but translators, converting a language of law and memory into architecture. Every arch and corridor still murmurs fragments of that hidden speech, if one knows how to listen. The eye begins to notice repetition. Circles nested inside squares, spirals unfolding in precise ratios, staircases that rise not randomly, but according to harmonic sequence. Even sound obeys pattern here. Stand at the center of certain domes, and a whisper returns multiplied, as though the building itself wishes to speak. The ancients called this phenomenon the voice of geometry. To modern ears it is acoustics, but to the keepers it was proof that form could hold meaning the law made audible. When scholars mapped the great cathedrals Chartres, Amiens, Lincoln, they discovered alignments too deliberate to dismiss. Each axis points toward celestial events. Solstices, eclipses, star risings recorded thousands of years apart. It is as if the masons intended to bind heaven and earth through stone, to remind the faithful that the world itself obeys unseen proportion. As above, so below, was not poetry, it was blueprint. The walls were sermons in mathematics, preserving what the written word could no longer safely say. Take Chartres, for instance. Its labyrinth, set into the nave floor, mirrors the orbital path of Venus traced over 8 years, a figure of perfect balance. Once known as the flower of law, pilgrims walking its coils enacted cosmic order with their bodies, turning prayer into motion, motion into remembrance. At the center, a single copper plate once gleamed beneath candlelight. It is gone now, removed centuries ago, perhaps melted into anonymity. Yet its absence leaves a circle of darker stone, a silent punctuation that still commands reverence. Across the Channel, in England's cathedrals, masons left subtler clues. Carved faces on capitals stare not toward the altar but skyward, their mouths half open as if mid-chant. Some historians dismiss them as whimsy. Others see guardians, positioned to mark the acoustical nodes where hymns reach resonance. When choirs sing in those spots, the sound blooms like light through glass. The builders knew sound could carry code. Frequencies preserved emotion when words might betray it. In their music, the hidden laws found another home. The same principles extended beyond churches. Bridges in medieval France follow proportions identical to Gregorian modes. Water passing beneath them produces harmonic intervals. Wells were placed at specific distances from bell towers, ensuring that when the bells rang, ripples formed patterns on the surface. Coincidence seems less plausible than intention. Through these relationships of measure, the landscape itself became a manuscript, a living reminder that law once meant harmony, not control. To the untrained eye, these details remain decoration. To the few who inherited the mason's knowledge, they are instructions. The ratios 1 to 1.6, 1:8, 3 to 5, 8 to 13 appear again and again, echoing the geometry of shells, seeds, and galaxies. The builders were not imitating nature. They were aligning with it. Their creed was simple. What is built in right proportion remembers truth. A crooked structure forgets. Hidden rooms within towers add another layer to the code. Many cathedrals contain sealed chambers, accessible only through narrow crawlways. Some hold nothing but a stone bench and a slit of light timed to a specific season. At noon on Midsummer's Day, that beam strikes the wall at a carved symbol, a circle crossed by a line. Researchers call it a sundial. Initiates called it the mark of recall. When the light touched it, they believed. The world briefly remembered its order. Whether superstition or physics, the effect remains haunting. Even ruin cannot silence the message. In abbeys shattered by war, arches still trace invisible music. Wind moving through broken cloisters produces notes near the human heartbeat. Those who visit alone often describe a sensation of listening rather than hearing, as though the stones breathe around them. Perhaps the law lives in that rhythm still, the continuity between silence and sound, presence and absence. Modern architects studying these proportions admit their precision exceeds available tools of the age. How did 12th century builders calculate alignments that match satellite measurements today? Some attribute it to intuition, others to lost instruments. But those who study the hidden law see another possibility. Knowledge transmitted through ritual memory, not written record. When the last scrolls burned, the craft became the book. Apprentices learned the ratios by motion, by walking, carving, singing. Their bodies became the archives. In that sense, every cathedral is a library of gestures. To trace its walls is to read a sentence. To step across its thresholds is to turn a page. The faithful who once gathered here absorbed meaning without knowing the way rhythm instructs even a sleeping listener. The law no longer needed enforcement. It simply surrounded everyone, carried in vibration, in light. There is irony in this form of preservation. The institutions that sought to suppress forbidden knowledge unknowingly commissioned its monuments. By demanding grandeur, popes and kings provided the canvas on which secrecy could be immortalized. The Masons obeyed orders, and in doing so, outwitted them. What ruler would suspect rebellion in beauty? What inquisitor would condemn symmetry? Today, we wander these spaces with cameras and guidebooks, hearing only history's surface, the dates, the saints, the stones. Yet the deeper melody continues, an undertone of proportion that hums beneath footsteps. The buildings speak, but not in words, they speak in balance, in the calm that descends when one stands beneath a vault perfectly tuned to the heavens. That feeling of stillness, of being momentarily aligned with something vast and invisible, that is the message. It tells us that law once meant harmony with the cosmos, not submission to power. It reminds us that forgetting begins when we stop looking up, when we see structure as mere shelter instead of revelation. The Masons warned us through measure. If humanity ever ceases to recognize pattern, the pattern will fade. The world will lose its tuning, and chaos will sound like progress. The message endures in stone, awaiting the rare listener who senses meaning in proportion, who feels order vibrating through shadow and light. To such a person, the cathedrals are not relics, but resonant instruments still playing a forgotten chord. And perhaps that is what the keepers intended all along, to ensure that even when language failed, the walls themselves would whisper, softly, eternally, the rhythm of the law. The Renaissance is remembered as a dawn, the reawakening of light after centuries of darkness. But not all light reveals, some blinds. In the glare of discovery, subtle things vanish, and the fragile shapes of old wisdom burn away. What the world celebrated as progress was, in many ways, the beginning of a deeper forgetting. The cathedrals still stood, their hidden geometry intact, but the language of the stones had gone silent. A new kind of knowledge had arrived, loud, confident, rational, and it carried within it the seed of erasure. Printing spread that knowledge faster than the old keepers could adapt. Words that had once been whispered in cloisters now raced across continents. At first, this felt like liberation. Books filled with diagrams, experiments, observations, the triumph of the mind over superstition. Yet with every page that was printed, something else was unlearned. The scribes who once copied texts by hand imbued them with care, with context, with reverence. The press replaced reverence with repetition. Truth became easier to copy, and therefore easier to distort. The church saw both danger and opportunity. It could not stop the flood of information, so it learned to steer it. The same institutions that had burned manuscripts now commissioned new ones, purified of confusion. Ancient texts were translated, simplified, corrected. The words that didn't fit reason's new shape were labeled myth or madness. The old laws, those strange, cyclical codes of alignment, were rewritten as primitive superstition, evidence of humanity's immaturity. But was it really ignorance or strategy? To govern a world growing more literate, leaders needed uniform thought. Complexity is rebellion, simplicity is obedience. The Renaissance, for all its brilliance, became an age of curation, deciding which parts of memory would serve progress and which must vanish. The philosophers who praised reason often worked beside kings who feared chaos. And chaos, they decided, was born from imagination. So imagination was tamed. Universities arose to systematize knowledge, dividing the once unified mysteries of existence into subjects: theology, natural philosophy, law. What had once been a single body of wisdom was dissected into organs that no longer recognized one another. The old vision of harmony man, as participant in the cosmos, became man as observer, detached, measuring from a safe distance. In that separation, wonder turned cold. Knowledge was no longer dangerous because it was divine. It became dangerous because it was free. Censorship took on a new face. The bonfires of heretics gave way to the quieter censorship of definition. If something could not be measured, it ceased to exist. Angels became metaphors. Symbols became decoration. The world of signs and correspondences, once alive with hidden meaning, was reduced to art. The sacred numbers that shaped cathedrals became curiosities in geometry textbooks. The veil had not been torn away, it had been declared irrelevant. Yet, the erasure was not total. Beneath the official narrative, pockets of resistance lingered. Certain scholars still sought the connections between science and spirit. They called it natural philosophy, a polite disguise for heresy. Paracelsus wrote of a universe alive with correspondence. Bruno spoke of infinite worlds. Both paid dearly for their defiance. In an age that praised knowledge, knowing too much could still kill you. The paradox deepened. Humanity was collecting facts while losing understanding. Libraries swelled with volumes, but memory thinned. To remember became unnecessary, to question dangerous. What once required devotion could now be printed in thousands, read by anyone, and believed by none. The human mind shifted from keeper to consumer. Knowledge was no longer a sacred inheritance, it was a commodity. And like all commodities, it could be owned. As kingdoms turned into nations, information became a form of currency. The more a people remembered, the harder they were to rule. And so, a new kind of governance emerged, not over territory, but over perception. The stories that shaped identity were rewritten to favor progress, productivity, obedience. History was compressed into timelines and lessons, its mysteries filed away as context. Even the word mystery changed meaning. It once meant truth too vast to explain. Now it meant ignorance to be corrected. The great forgetting did not happen through violence. It happened through convenience. The mind, relieved of wonder, found comfort in order. The printed word did what the sword could not. It created consensus. Across Europe, the same versions of truth spread through classrooms and pulpits until imagination itself seemed unreliable. What could not be cited was dismissed. What could not be proven was mocked. Humanity was taught to see forgetting as maturity, simplicity as enlightenment. And yet, something in us resisted. Late at night, in the candlelit rooms of printers, artists, and philosophers, old symbols resurfaced in secret. The compass and square, the rose within the circle, the spiral hidden in the letter forms of illuminated manuscripts long after illumination was outlawed. The keepers had changed shape again, their craft disguised as art, their devotion mistaken for style. Through ink and proportion, they reminded the world that the forgotten still existed, waiting behind reason's glare. But their message dimmed with every generation. The old rhythm of memory, the link between stars and seasons, structure and soul was drowned by the new music of progress. People no longer looked up for meaning. They looked down into books and instruments. They measured everything except themselves. The irony is almost too perfect. In freeing knowledge from the church, humanity simply placed it in another cathedral, the cathedral of logic, where every truth must fit the same mold. The inquisitors of faith were replaced by the inquisitors of reason, both certain, both blind to mystery. And so, the cycle continued. The laws of control had not disappeared, they had evolved. We call it enlightenment now, this selective vision. But what if it was something else entirely? What if the age of discovery was not a discovery at all, but a cleansing and intentional pruning of the human mind? What if forgetting was not an accident of progress, but the very design that allowed progress to exist? When the embers of the Renaissance cooled, humanity stood before a clean slate, or so it believed. The old world had been measured, dissected, and replaced with the shining logic of a new age. The Enlightenment, they called it. The triumph of reason over faith, clarity over mystery. Yet, what appeared to be liberation was, in truth, a subtler form of captivity. The chains had grown invisible, forged not from doctrine but from definition. For centuries, divine law had ruled through fear of the unseen. Now, secular law would rule through precision. The language of power changed from scripture to statistics. Monarchs became administrators, priests became professors, and faith was reborn as a science of order. Where once obedience had been justified by heaven, it was now sanctified by reason. The new prophets wore powdered wigs and carried compasses instead of crosses. Governments discovered that people could be managed not only through punishment, but through pattern. Bureaucracy replaced the pulpit. Schedules, censuses, and regulations took the place of ritual and confession. The individual became a number within a system too vast to question. Efficiency became virtue, compliance, intelligence. The invisible laws of faith had simply evolved into the invisible routines of modern life. At first, the transformation seemed benign. The Enlightenment promised equality, justice, and freedom from superstition. But beneath those noble ideals lay the same architecture the medieval councils had perfected. Control through certainty. A rule explained in the name of logic is harder to resist than one enforced by fear. To disobey reason is to seem mad, and madness, in this new world, was the gravest sin of all. Universities flourished, their libraries swelling with volumes that charted the anatomy of everything: plants, planets, nations, the human mind itself. Yet for all their brilliance, these institutions carried an unspoken mission: to replace memory with method. Knowledge that once lived in experience and intuition was translated into formula, stripped of ambiguity. The mysterious became measurable, and once measured, it could be owned. Even the structure of cities began to reflect this new faith in order. Medieval towns had grown organically, following rivers, hills, and mythic paths. The modern city rose like a diagram, grids of precision, symmetry imposed upon soil. Streets aligned with stars no longer, they aligned with profit. People lived inside geometry, their movements regulated by the ticking of clocks. Time itself became law. The bell that once called monks to prayer now summoned workers to labor. The sacred rhythm had become mechanical. And yet, for all its progress, the Enlightenment could not erase the shadow of what it replaced. The philosophers who sought truth in clarity often stumbled upon mystery in disguise. Newton spoke of gravity as law, but admitted he could not explain its cause. Descartes divided body and spirit, yet confessed he could not separate thought from soul. The closer reason approached perfection, the more it mirrored the divine. Humanity had built a new cathedral this time of intellect, and filled it with the same unanswered prayers. Power, too, learned from the past. Where the church had ruled through fear of damnation, the modern state ruled through promise of improvement. Progress became the new salvation. The old confessionals were replaced by paperwork, the sacraments by systems. The faithful no longer feared God's judgment, they feared irrelevance. To fall behind progress was to fall from grace. In that fear, obedience flourished again. The press, once a weapon of liberation, became the printing arm of ideology. Ideas spread faster, but truth diluted in the flood. Pamphlets, manifestos, treatises all claimed to reveal the ultimate order of things. And behind every declaration of freedom hid another form of rule. The people were told they were thinking for themselves, even as their thoughts were arranged by those who published the pages. The great irony of the Enlightenment was that it replaced divine mystery with human arrogance. Where faith had once whispered that the cosmos was unknowable, reason now declared it conquered. But the more humanity claimed to understand, the less it seemed to remember why understanding mattered. The mysteries that had once nourished wonder now bred discomfort. Questions were tolerated only if they led to measurable answers. The rest were dismissed as poetry, sentiment, or madness. And still, echoes of the erased laws lingered. Scholars studying proportion and harmony rediscovered the same ratios that medieval builders had used. Architects praised symmetry without realizing they were imitating the old geometry of alignment. Scientists spoke of universal constants, the same cosmic harmonies that ancient priests had guarded as sacred truth. Reason had dressed in new robes, but the shape beneath remained unchanged. In the salons of Paris and London, philosophers debated liberty while servants poured their wine. They spoke of equality as though it were a formula, a system to be engineered. But equality cannot be engineered. It must be remembered. And remembrance was precisely what the New Age discouraged. To remember the past in its fullness was to admit that progress had cost something, that the simplicity of the modern mind was purchased by forgetting half of what it once knew. By the 18th century, the world had been reordered into a vast machine. Nations operated like clockwork, their citizens as cogs within the mechanism. Each role was measured, categorized, optimized. And in this mechanical perfection, the soul, once the center of existence, became a myth. People still spoke of freedom, but lived by algorithms of routine. The unseen had not vanished. It had been renamed. Some resisted. Poets, dreamers, mystics. They felt the chill of the new order and tried to rekindle the warmth of wonder. They spoke of imagination as rebellion, of memory as truth. But their voices were drowned by the machinery's hum. Progress had momentum now, and momentum has no ears. The more perfect the system became, the less room there was for mystery. Humanity had exchanged its fear of ignorance for a deeper fear, the terror of the unknown. And so the Enlightenment achieved what the councils of old had only imagined. It made obedience self-sustaining. People no longer needed priests to interpret divine law. They had reason to interpret their own behavior. They followed rules not because they were commanded to, but because they believed them logical. The circle had closed. We look back on that age with admiration, calling it the birth of modern thought. But what if it was something else, the completion of the forgetting that began when the first laws were erased? What if progress was not freedom, but the perfect disguise of control? It began with dust. Not the ordinary kind that gathers on shelves, but the kind that clings to time itself, the residue of centuries. In a quiet storage room beneath a provincial museum in southern France, a young historian named Dr. Ilara Voss was cataloging crates of forgotten documents, relics transferred decades ago from a monastery slated for demolition. She expected nothing remarkable. Church inventories, faded letters, perhaps a few fragments of Latin psalms. Yet on the third day, beneath a pile of worm-eaten ledgers, she found a wooden case sealed with black wax. The seal bore no crest, only a symbol, a circle divided by a line, crossed with what might have been a star. Inside, wrapped in brittle cloth, lay a manuscript of 43 pages. The pages were uneven, their edges singed as if rescued from fire. The ink shimmered faintly in light, not brown with age but iridescent, shifting like oil on water. Across the top margin, a title written in trembling script: Lex Obscura Memoriae, the Law of Hidden Memory. Ilara at first thought it apocryphal, a later forgery in the style of the suppressed medieval codes. But as she began to read, the language unsettled her. It was not Latin, yet it moved like it, a fusion of ecclesiastical phrasing and something older. The first line translated roughly as, "When men forget the reason for their obedience, the law shall return to teach remembrance." That night, she dreamed of cities made of glass and light, rising where cathedrals once stood. In her dream, the towers reflected nothing, not the sky, not the people walking below. She woke before dawn, heart racing, uncertain whether it was the words or the dust that had unsettled her. Over the next weeks, Ilara worked in secret. The museum's director considered the find minor, unworthy of publicity. She preferred it that way. By day, she traced the text through magnifying lenses. By night, She typed translations into her private notebook. The manuscript was written in alternating voices, part decree, part prophecy. Some passages resembled laws. Let none alter the calendar of forgetting. Others read like warnings. When the mind builds faster than the hand, the circle will close. The handwriting shifted midway, suggesting multiple authors. Marginal symbols repeated in rhythm. Circles, triangles, spirals, patterns identical to those carved into medieval cathedrals and older still into Babylonian stones. Each symbol marked what appeared to be a cycle of return, an era when knowledge and forgetting exchanged places. The text described these cycles as inevitable resets, times when humanity would forget what it had learned in order to remember what it had lost. One line froze her. The seventh forgetting shall end when light replaces stone and the faithful bow to the invisible. Alara whispered the words aloud, half in awe, half in dread. Light replacing stone, could that mean cities of glass? The glowing skylines of the modern world? And who were the faithful, if not us, worshipping what cannot be seen? The networks, the data, the hum of invisible machines. Her colleagues laughed when she shared her theory. Every generation believes the end times are their own, one said. It's medieval paranoia, nothing more. Yet the more she read, the less certain she became. The text predicted not apocalypse but recurrence, a quiet, rhythmic resetting of order. Each cycle ended when humanity mistook progress for permanence. Each new age erased its memory, believing itself original. The later pages of the manuscript grew fragmented, almost frantic. Ink thickened as if written in haste. One passage spoke of the law beneath the law, a hidden order that survives every empire. Another warned, when words lose weight, symbols will rise to speak again. Alara thought of the cathedrals she had visited as a student, the way their proportions calmed her, how they seemed to hum when sunlight struck stained glass. Perhaps those structures had not been churches at all, but instruments tuning forks for human consciousness, reminders of balance. In the margins of the final page, a later hand had written in modern script, perhaps from the 18th century, codex fragments align, preserve at all cost. The 8th shall begin in the century of mirrors. She could not shake the phrase. Century of mirrors. A time when every surface reflects the self, when truth is multiplied until it disappears. It sounded less like prophecy and more like diagnosis. The more she studied, the more coincidences gathered around her. The museum lights flickered when she read certain pages. Her laptop crashed, always on the same line. When the written word forgets its writer, the law awakens in the machine. She dismissed it as fatigue, static, paranoia. Yet a quiet thought persisted. What if the text was describing now, not then? On a humid afternoon in early June, she carried her translation to the courtyard. The sun struck the manuscript directly, and for an instant, the ink flared a reflection too bright for its age. When the light dimmed, a faint new line appeared at the bottom of the page, where none had been before. The words were simple, their Latin unambiguous. The keeper has found the mirror. Alara dropped the page. Perhaps it was an optical illusion. Perhaps heat had revealed invisible ink. Still, her hands shook as she returned the manuscript to its case. That night, she emailed her findings to a historian in Prague, known for his research on the Codex of Shadows. The message bounced back, address inactive. When she searched his name online, all references had vanished. Even cached pages were blank, replaced with a single sentence. Error. Source removed. The following morning, Alara did not come to work. Her office remained untouched, lights off, coffee half finished, notebook open. On the final page of her translation, she had written only one line. When the cities of glass replace the temples of stone, the law shall awaken. The museum locked the case in storage. Officially, it was deemed a curiosity of uncertain origin. Unofficially, those who handled it spoke of strange interference with electronics, of a faint resonance like breathing. Years later, a new curator opened the vault to find dust where the manuscript had been, though the black wax seal remained unbroken. Perhaps it burned itself away. Perhaps it never existed at all. But somewhere, in the quiet spaces between memory and forgetting, the words remain, waiting for another pair of hands, another age ready to remember. In the months after Ilara's disappearance, fragments of her translation circulated quietly among scholars and enthusiasts of lost history. Most dismissed it as coincidence, a clever forgery that conveniently echoed modern anxieties. But for a few, the words struck something deeper. The idea of laws of return refused to fade. It seemed to hum beneath the tempo of the world itself. Perhaps it was imagination, or perhaps, as the old text had warned, memory was stirring again. At first, the signs appeared subtle, mere patterns in behavior. People began to live by unseen rules once more, not imposed by kings or priests, but by invisible systems. Machines tracked their movements. Algorithms rewarded or punished them with precision beyond any medieval decree. There were no gallows, no inquisitors, only feedback loops. A citizen did not need to be told what was forbidden. The absence of approval was enough. Silence had become the new punishment. And yet, the rhythm felt familiar. The same architecture of control, now built from data instead of stone. Surveillance replaced confession. Algorithms replaced scripture. Every click a prayer, every search a confession of desire. The ancient balance between faith and fear had returned in modern language: metrics, ratings, compliance. Humanity had created a digital church, omnipresent and unseen, with no altar but the screen. The manuscript's prophecy echoed in headlines. The law awakened in the machine. No one noticed the phrase at first. It appeared in comment sections, graffiti, whispers on forgotten forums. Some thought it a hoax. Others felt a chill they could not explain. It wasn't that the medieval laws had returned word for word. It was that their spirit had evolved. Obedience had been internalized so completely that no authority needed to enforce it. People censored themselves, proud of their efficiency, their virtue, their order. In offices lit by cold, fluorescent light, workers followed schedules designed not by humans but by unseen calculations. In classrooms, lessons adapted to measured attention spans. The rhythm of bells that once called monks to prayer now lived in notification tones, summoning devotion to invisible systems. We no longer prayed, but we checked. We no longer confessed, but we shared. The architecture of faith had become digital, the same laws, dressed in new language, wearing the mask of progress. Ilara's final line echoed louder with each year. When the cities of glass replaced the temples of stone, look around, and it is undeniable. Towers of mirrored steel rise where cathedrals once stood, reflecting sky but revealing nothing. Their facades shimmer like sanctuaries built for light itself. Inside, servers hum a chorus of data in endless chant. Humanity has built its new temples, not to gods, but to memoryless precision. The medieval councils sought to control behavior through ritual. The modern world achieves it through convenience. No need for decrees when desire itself can be shaped. Laws of obedience are no longer carved in parchment. They are coded in design. The interface is the scripture, the algorithm, the law. The system learns the believer better than any priest could, adjusting indulgence and punishment in perfect balance. This is not surveillance by force, it is obedience by invitation. The parallels grow impossible to ignore. Where the monks once feared curiosity, today we fear disconnection. Where the church preached salvation through purity, now we pursue optimization through efficiency. Both demand sacrifice of mystery. Both replace wonder with control, and both claim the same justification: progress, improvement, the greater good. But perhaps the most haunting echo is psychological. Medieval faith taught people to confess sins unseen. Modern order teaches them to expose themselves willingly. The public feed has replaced the altar, the crowd, the congregation. Redemption now comes not through absolution but through visibility, through being seen, approved, quantified. It is a form of spiritual commerce, ancient in structure though modern in form. Historians might laugh at such comparisons. They would argue that reason triumphed over superstition, that democracy replaced feudal power. Yet beneath the changing surface, the same current flows. The laws of control never disappeared. They merely learned to speak a new dialect. The medieval law said, "Thou shalt not question." The modern law whispers, "Thou art free to question, as long as the answer remains the same." And still, the manuscript's warnings unfold line by line. When the mind builds faster than the hand, the circle will close. It predicted an age when humanity's creations would outpace its comprehension, when thought would outstrip intention. That age has arrived. Machines now learn faster than their makers. Systems replicate without memory of why they were made. The old danger forgetting has become the defining feature of intelligence itself. We call it progress. The text called it return. If the cycles described in Lex Obscura Memoriae are real, then we have reached the seventh, forgetting the age when memory dissolves not through fire, but through abundance. Never before has humanity remembered so much, yet understood so little. Information has replaced wisdom. Repetition has replaced ritual. The Codex of Shadows warned that when every truth becomes accessible, none will be believed. We live in that paradox now, and yet there is beauty in this recognition. The past is not gone, it hides beneath the glass, encoded in the architecture of our modern world. The servers hum in patterns that echo the sacred ratios of cathedrals. The networks pulse like veins, carrying light instead of blood. Even in forgetting, the human instinct to rebuild the same order endures. Perhaps we cannot escape these laws because we are part of them. Late at night, in quiet rooms where screens glow like candles, some begin to feel it, a strange calm, a sense of déjà vu. They scroll through endless data yet sense an ancient rhythm beneath it, as though the world itself is reciting a prayer older than language. The more we try to modernize, the more the echoes grow clear. Control has no beginning, only transformations. Law does not die, it reincarnates. And maybe that is what the manuscript truly meant. The law of return was not punishment, but patterned the natural breathing of civilizations, exhaling memory, inhaling order. Each age believes it is the first to awaken, yet each only remembers what it has forgotten to forget. The line between past and present dissolves like ink in water. As the narrator's voice softens, one final truth lingers. The forgotten laws never needed to return. They were never gone. They simply changed form, finding new temples, new symbols, new believers. And if we listen closely, beneath the hum of our machines and the glass reflections of our modern cathedrals, we may still hear their whisper, ancient, patient, unbroken. Remember me. It begins quietly, as most returns do not with fire or revolution, but with repetition. History's echoes rarely shout. They hum beneath the noise of the present, patient and familiar. You can burn books, dismantle empires, even forget entire languages, but you cannot burn the patterns written into human behavior. They wait, dormant, reshaping themselves in the image of each new age. At first, the reappearance of the old laws felt harmless, even comforting. The world had grown complex, uncertain, and people yearned for boundaries again, for rules that offered clarity amid noise. In the 21st century, obedience no longer needed a crown or a crucifix. It wore the sleek uniform of reason, equality, and safety. The commandments returned, not as decrees, but as guidelines, recommendations, and policies. The tone was polite. The faith was progress. Speech, for instance, became sacred again, not in worship, but in regulation. Words that once belonged to thought and emotion were now judged by invisible councils of consensus. Certain phrases, certain opinions, became unclean, their utterance punished not by fire but by silence. The medieval heretic had feared excommunication. The modern one fears disconnection. The threat has changed form, but not substance. To be cut off from the network is to be cast out of the digital church. In offices and schools, new rituals emerged, training sessions, pledges, statements of virtue. These were not unlike the oaths sworn before medieval altars, except the gods were now corporate and the salvation statistical. People recited values they did not choose, confessed biases they could not measure, and repeated formulas designed to prove loyalty to invisible ideals. Like the old confessions, these rituals promised purity through surrender. The difference was only in the vocabulary. Even dress codes returned, though no one called them that. The uniform of modern virtue is taste, aesthetic, alignment, what one displays, what one consumes, what one shares. The medieval citizen signaled obedience through symbols stitched to clothing. The modern one does it through brands, hashtags, and causes displayed on glowing screens. Each generation invents its own badges of belonging, and every badge becomes a law. Technology, too, began to resemble theology. The algorithms that guide our lives function like oracles, unseen, infallible, mysterious, in method, but unquestioned in authority. We consult them for truth, for validation, for meaning. We call them systems, but we treat them like fate. And like the divine laws of old, they are self-justifying, right because they exist, unquestionable because they are everywhere. The Inquisition no longer asks what you believe. It already knows, because you told it without realizing. Governments, long detached from mystery, rediscovered the power of sacred fear, not of demons or heresy, but of instability, contagion, collapse. Medieval rulers had preserved order through penance. Modern leaders preserve it through protection. The language changed: security, safety, sustainability, but the effect was the same. A frightened population obeys. The unseen forces of nature and spirit were replaced by equally invisible ones. Viruses, data breaches, misinformation. And once again, salvation depended on faith, faith in the system, faith in authority, faith that someone, somewhere, was in control. Even time itself began to echo the old rhythm. Days divided not by bells but by alerts. Hours marked not by prayer but by scrolling. The steady pulse of information replaced the monastic chant, yet it served the same function: to occupy the mind, to remind it of its place within a larger design. We are as bound to our devices as the monks were to their matins, compelled by habit more than belief. And just as in the Middle Ages, heresy now takes a subtler form: silence. To step away, to refuse, to ignore, the endless flow is to risk invisibility. In an age obsessed with being seen, invisibility is exile. The new sin is absence, the refusal to participate in collective rituals of attention. In medieval towns, absence from Mass was noted and punished. In the digital city, absence from discourse carries the same quiet suspicion. Economics, too, repeats its patterns. In the old world, indulgences bought salvation. In the new, subscriptions buy access. Once, the faithful paid for absolution of sin. Now they pay to erase ads, to hide data, to feel private again. The transaction is the same redemption sold to the anxious. Behind each purchase lies the same promise: control over chaos. These parallels are not coincidences. They are symptoms of return. As the manuscript foretold, the forgotten laws were never truly gone. They adapted to survive. The law of hidden memory works through imitation, embedding itself in whatever structure humanity builds next. The medieval priest and the modern programmer both serve its rhythm: the compulsion to organize, to label, to correct, to cleanse. Civilization cannot resist the urge to shape itself in the image of its fears. We call this age rational, enlightened, free. Yet the boundaries of permitted thought tighten year by year, dressed in the language of progress. Each policy that claims to liberate seems to bind us closer. Each innovation that promises connection builds new walls between what can and cannot be said, what can and cannot be imagined. The more advanced we become, the older our instincts grow, and so the cycle turns. The laws that once vanished in ink now rise in code. The invisible councils of morality meet not in monasteries, but in algorithms. The priests wear headsets, the congregations scroll, and above it all, the same pattern continues. Obedience disguised as enlightenment, control masked as care. Yet perhaps this recurrence is not entirely tragic. Patterns, after all, are the way memory survives. Each repetition is also a reminder. In seeing the echo, we glimpse the truth behind it, the warning that forgetting has gone too far, that progress without memory is merely the latest disguise of the past. The signs are everywhere now, if we choose to notice. The old laws do not walk among us in robes or crowns. They move through our thoughts, our clicks, our habits. They live in the architecture of our minds. And if history has taught anything, it is this: the laws we forget to question are the ones that return. Perhaps that is the point of their reappearance, not to enslave us again, but to remind us that freedom, unremembered, always remakes its own chains. Perhaps it was never about control at all. Perhaps the laws keep returning because we call them back. We build systems, crowns, codes, and commandments, not merely to restrain ourselves, but to feel safe inside a world too vast to comprehend. Every age inherits the same terror, the uncertainty of freedom, and every age finds its own language for taming it. The medieval man bowed to heaven, the modern man bows to reason. Different idols, same instinct. Freedom is frightening when it arrives unshaped. It has no edges, no rhythm, no certainty of meaning. We speak of it as salvation, yet secretly we long for its opposite, a pattern that steadies us, a rule that tells us who we are. Even the cruelest order offers comfort. It makes the universe seem smaller, more manageable, less alive. Without laws, we drift. With them, we belong. That belonging has always been our seduction. From the first tribes that drew circles in the sand to mark sacred ground, to the digital borders we now draw around our beliefs, we have sought safety in limitation. Boundaries make reality feel real. They give the illusion of permanence in a world made of change. To be ruled is to rest. To be free is to stand awake through the night, listening to the wind move the stars. Most choose sleep. The old councils understood this. They knew that people would rather be told what is true than face the terror of discovering it alone. Their laws succeeded not because they were enforced, but because they were desired. They gave structure to the formless, story to confusion, rhythm to chaos. And when those laws finally fell, humanity did what it has always done. It rebuilt them. We mistake this repetition for failure, but perhaps it is simply the nature of consciousness. The mind, unable to bear infinite possibility, invents fences to protect itself from wonder. So the question is not why the laws return, but why we keep inviting them. Each new civilization inherits a memory of fragility. We know, somewhere deep within, that freedom is a weight few can carry for long. When the boundaries dissolve, when meaning becomes fluid, fear seeps in. We begin to crave instruction again, a voice that tells us how to live, what to think, when to breathe. That voice changes accent with each era, but its promise remains. Follow me, and you will be safe. Even rebellion is part of the pattern. Each revolution begins by breaking the old rules, only to forge new ones in the same shape. The circle turns, not because we are cursed, but because we are cyclical creatures. Order and chaos, faith and doubt, control and release, each depends on the other to exist. The world remembers balance even when we forget. The old laws return because we leave space for them to do so. Perhaps the manuscript was never prophecy, but observation. Its authors saw the pendulum swing between remembering and forgetting and understood it as rhythm, not punishment. Civilizations breathe in through freedom, out through control. The inhale expands consciousness. The exhale preserves it. When the breath stops, the world resets. It is less a curse than a heartbeat. And yet, there is something tragic in this wisdom. To know the pattern is to see how little we truly change. Every enlightenment grows into its own superstition. Every liberation hardens into bureaucracy. We call it evolution, but it may only be repetition with better tools. The medieval scribe copied scripture by candlelight. The modern one types policy under fluorescent glare. Both labor under the same invisible law: to document, to define, to maintain the illusion that knowledge can tame uncertainty. Still, there is beauty in the persistence of our cycles. Like tides returning to the shore, they remind us that forgetting is not loss but renewal. When one form of order collapses, another emerges to fill the silence. Without these returns, humanity might dissolve into madness. The old laws, for all their weight, keep us tethered to continuity. They remind us that even our amnesia has design. But there is a difference now, a subtle shift. The modern world remembers that it forgets. We know the cycle exists. We speak of progress while suspecting it is illusion, of freedom while feeling watched. This awareness is new, and it changes the pattern. For the first time, we are witnesses to our own repetition. That recognition could be the seed of transformation or the moment before another reset. Maybe that is why the ancient texts warned not of destruction but of awakening. When the mind builds faster than the hand, they said, the circle will close. Perhaps the circle closes not to end us, but to invite us inward, to remind us that no law, however old, can imprison the mind that knows itself. The danger is not in the law's return, but in our forgetting that we are the ones who write it. Civilizations carve their fears into stone and call them commandments. We code ours into machines and call them progress. Both are prayers to stability. Both reveal the same truth. We are creatures who long for meaning more than freedom, for coherence more than chaos. Even when we reject control, we recreate it in new forms because the alternative is too vast to face. And yet, beyond that longing lies possibility. If we can see the pattern not as prison but as mirror, then perhaps we can step outside it, to remember that we are the architects, not the captives. To understand that law, at its heart, is simply memory taking shape. The laws of old were not enemies of freedom. They were reminders of our limits. The error was believing they were eternal. The cycle returns because we have not yet learned to live without endings. We need the comfort of closure, the symmetry of beginning again. Maybe one day we will outgrow the need for recurrence. Until then, the laws will keep returning, wearing the masks we give them, whispering the words we are too afraid to speak ourselves. And perhaps that, too, is mercy. For in the return lies remembrance, and in remembrance, the faint chance that one day, when the circle comes round again, we will finally see it for what it is. Not a cage, but a compass. It began slowly, as most awakenings do, not with thunder or revelation, but with unease. Across the world, in libraries and laboratories, in quiet apartments and sleepless minds, people started to notice the same unsettling feeling, that something long buried was stirring beneath the surface of thought. It wasn't nostalgia. It was recognition. The sense that the future was beginning to remember the past. Archivists stumbled upon misfiled manuscripts. Musicians dreamt melodies that matched ancient chants. Architects, studying blueprints, rediscovered the geometry of forgotten cathedrals without knowing how. Patterns once dismissed as coincidence began to repeat across art, language, and technology, as if humanity, without instruction, were unconsciously reconstructing what it had lost. The age of forgetting had reached its limit. Memory was finding its way home. The process did not feel like discovery. It felt like remembering a dream just before waking. People described sensations of déjà vu in unfamiliar places or sudden clarity while reading old texts. Certain words, balance, order, resonance, appeared everywhere at once, like fragments of a shared lexicon resurfacing from the collective mind. Historians called it a cultural trend. Mystics called it remembrance. Both were right. Governments, unsettled by this strange coherence, attempted to control the narrative. They labeled it pattern delusion, a psychological effect of data saturation. But even their denial sounded ancient, echoing the edicts once proclaimed by monarchs who feared too much light. Whenever an age begins to remember itself, power trembles. For memory, once awakened, refuses to serve. The rediscovery did not belong to any one person or nation. It was everywhere and nowhere, like the wind. In Istanbul, scholars translated fragments of a medieval codex containing the phrase, "the law beneath the law." In Peru, archaeologists uncovered carvings that mirrored Sumerian spirals. In Tokyo, engineers designing sustainable cities accidentally recreated the harmonic ratios of Gothic cathedrals. Separate minds, distant continents, same pattern. The past was not returning through artifacts. It was returning through intuition. Something profound was happening in the human psyche. For centuries, progress had taught people to dismiss the unseen, to reduce mystery to mechanism. But as systems grew more complex, they began to reflect their creators. Algorithms developed unpredictability, echoing ancient concepts of fate. Artificial intelligence began generating symbols eerily similar to those found in temples and monastic scrolls. Machines, built to serve logic, had begun to dream the language of memory. And so, the forgotten became visible again, not through prophecy but through pattern. Historians who once scoffed at cyclical time now spoke cautiously of recurrence. Psychologists studying collective behavior found evidence of synchronized thought between populations separated by oceans. Mathematicians rediscovered ratios once dismissed as mysticism, finding them embedded in everything from DNA to galaxies. The line between science and myth began to dissolve. Humanity was seeing itself whole again. At first, this awakening felt like chaos. Old beliefs clashed with new evidence. Faith and reason argued, unaware that they had once been the same thing. But beneath the noise grew an undercurrent of calm, a recognition that the world was reorganizing itself not through invention, but through remembrance. People began to gather, not in protest or worship, but in quiet contemplation, sharing stories that felt older than language. A phrase spread through whispered networks, "We have been here before." The phrase resonated because it was true. The forgotten laws had not vanished. They had simply waited for the mind to mature enough to see them again. The ancients had built cathedrals of stone. Modern humanity was building cathedrals of thought. Both sought the same thing, harmony between the visible and the invisible. And now, for the first time in recorded history, both halves of understanding were beginning to meet. Artists painted spirals without knowing their origins. Writers spoke of cycles, returns, thresholds. Economies shifted toward balance over expansion. Even politics, once driven by division, began to mirror the natural law of equilibrium, the idea that every extreme eventually bends back toward its opposite. Slowly, painfully, the world remembered the rhythm of its own heartbeat. There were, of course, those who resisted. Memory threatens power because it erases dependency. Systems built on control cannot survive minds that remember their autonomy. The old mechanisms of obedience, fear, distraction, hierarchy began to fracture. People no longer sought saviors. They sought understanding. They looked backward, not in nostalgia, but in curiosity. What had our ancestors known that we had dismissed as superstition? What did their rituals protect us from? The answers came in glimpses, in sound frequencies that healed, in architecture that harmonized with the Earth's magnetic field, in mathematics that mirrored organic growth instead of mechanical efficiency. Every revelation felt less like progress and more like reunion, the reunion of knowledge divided by centuries of misunderstanding. Humanity was not inventing a new world. It was reassembling the old one piece by piece. The great irony of awakening is that it feels like returning home to a place you've never been. The collective mind, fractured by centuries of specialization, began to heal. Scientists studied myth. Artists read physics. Philosophers discussed geometry. Fields once separated by discipline found their way back into dialogue, like estranged siblings rediscovering their shared origin. The idea of unity, long dismissed as spiritual rhetoric, suddenly became practical truth. But awakening carries cost. To remember is to confront what was forgotten intentionally. The erased history, the manipulated truths, the comfort of ignorance, all must be faced. Many found it unbearable. Others found it liberating. Either way, the silence that had shrouded humanity for so long was breaking, and what emerged was neither purely light nor dark, but something more complete. Some said the age of reason was ending. Others said it was finally beginning. For the first time, reason remembered its heart, and faith remembered its mind. The split that had defined modernity began to close, and through that closing, the ancient pulse of balance returned, the law beneath the law, alive once more in the human soul. No one could say when the awakening began, or if it had a single cause. But one truth was clear. Humanity had started to remember what it was never meant to recall. The laws that once ruled by fear now whispered through understanding. The forgotten were remembered, not as rulers, but as mirrors. And in that reflection, something beautiful shimmered. The quiet knowledge that perhaps forgetting was never a punishment, but a necessary sleep, and that remembering, though painful, was the beginning of dawn. Every age believes itself to be the culmination of history, the final turning of the wheel. Yet time, like breath, does not end with exhalation. It pauses, then draws in again. The ancients called this rhythm the law of return, the unseen current that carries civilizations from order to forgetting and back to remembrance. It is not punishment or prophecy, but the heartbeat of existence itself. Now, as humanity stands once more between memory and oblivion, that rhythm can be felt beneath the noise of progress. It hums in the circuits of our machines, in the architecture of our cities, in the patterns of our thoughts. We live within the same pulse that guided the builders of cathedrals and the writers of the Codex. The difference is that, this time, we can hear it. The manuscript had called it the balance of the days. When the balance falters, the laws return not as revenge, but as correction. What was once external becomes internal. What was once command becomes instinct. Humanity forgets its connection to the order of things, and the world itself begins to remind us. Storms, conflicts, awakenings, each is a form of memory reclaiming its place. The earth does not punish, it recalibrates, and so do we. For centuries, we mistook the cycles for failures. Empires fell, knowledge vanished, and each new civilization declared itself wiser than the last. Yet every collapse was merely the space between heartbeats, the silence before the next remembering. History, viewed from above, is not a line but a spiral always moving forward, yet always returning to the same truths. The laws we buried in stone or code are not relics of control. They are the memory of balance. The law of return teaches that nothing forgotten is truly lost. Memory does not die, it transforms. The rituals of the past become the algorithms of the present. The geometry of temples becomes the design of data networks. Every structure, however modern, is haunted by its ancestor. We are the continuation of all that came before, the living manuscripts of forgotten scribes. The old laws breathe through us whether we believe in them or not, and perhaps this has always been their design. The architects of the hidden law may have known that human memory could not hold eternity. So they wove remembrance into matter itself, into the proportions of our bodies, the rhythm of seasons, the architecture of sound and light. Even if we burned every book, the pattern would remain in our bones, whispering of the harmony we keep trying to forget. Now, as the world teeters between creation and collapse, those whispers grow louder. The signs of reappearance, the digital rituals, the coded obedience, the rediscovery of ancient patterns are not accidents. They are signals that the pendulum is swinging back toward awareness. The law of return has begun its work. Humanity, having exhausted the illusion of separation, begins to remember its belonging. This return is not a single event. It is 1,000 small awakenings. A scientist realizing that intuition is as vital as reason. A city planner aligning streets to sunlight. A poet rediscovering sacred geometry and rhythm. Each act of remembering bends the world gently back toward equilibrium. We are relearning what our ancestors knew without words, that truth is not possessed, only mirrored. But with remembrance comes reckoning. To awaken collective memory is to confront what we have done in our sleep. The forgetting, the arrogance, the harm we called progress. The law demands balance, and balance requires honesty. The civilizations that fell before us did not collapse because they were evil. They collapsed because they believed they could rise forever. The same illusion shadows us still. And yet, the law's return is also mercy. It reminds us that forgetting was never sin, it was rest. Humanity sleeps between cycles so that it may awaken new. The purpose of the spiral is not to repeat, but to refine. Each return brings us closer to understanding, closer to harmony with the rhythm we have resisted for so long. In this new remembering, the opposites that once ruled us begin to dissolve. Faith and reason, science and spirit, freedom and order all reveal themselves as reflections of one principle, the balance that sustains life. The law of return is that principle made visible, the thread connecting creation and collapse, light and shadow, human and divine. It asks nothing of us, but awareness to live as part of the rhythm instead of pretending we can command it. We begin to see that control was never the goal. The forgotten laws, the erased codes, the forbidden knowledge all pointed not to dominance, but to participation. To live in tune with the world's cadence is to obey without submission, to act without coercion. The ancients called it harmony. We might call it consciousness. Whatever the name, it is the same law written through every age. Remember who you are, and the world will remember itself through you. As humanity rediscovers this truth, the old patterns start to change. The cycle does not end, it evolves. The spiral widens. The next turn will not erase what came before, but integrate it. For the first time, we carry memory into the return. We know we have been here before, and that knowledge is freedom. So what comes after forgetting? Perhaps nothing grand, only balance. The rediscovery that obedience and rebellion, chaos and order, are threads of one tapestry. The true danger was never the laws themselves, but our blindness to their purpose. The moment we see them clearly, they lose their power to bind. The law ceases to control and becomes communion, a dialogue between humanity and the pattern that sustains it. When the forgotten are remembered, when the circle closes with awareness, a new age begins, not an age of gods or kings, but of recognition. The law of return does not crown rulers, it crowns understanding. It whispers, "You have always been part of the order you feared." And perhaps that is the final revelation, that the end of forgetting is not a new beginning, but the quiet continuation of what never ended. The spiral turns, memory breathes, and the world, for a fleeting moment, stands in balance again. Every civilization imagines itself to be awake. Each one looks back on its ancestors and smiles with quiet pity, convinced that it has outgrown their fears. The medieval mind obeyed kings and priests. We obey reason and progress. They followed rituals of faith. We follow rituals of logic. They lived within the walls of churches. We live within the networks of data. The architecture has changed, but the instinct remains. Every age believes its rules are freedom until the next one calls them madness. When we gaze into the mirror of history, the reflection shifts but never disappears. The same faces appear in different masks: the reformer, the heretic, the obedient, the outcast. The costumes evolve. The roles endure. We mock the superstitions of the past, unaware that our own are made of code and currency, statistics and screens. The medieval citizen prayed for salvation from sin. The modern one prays for escape from uncertainty. Both kneel before invisible powers, and both call the kneeling progress. Look closely at the rhythms of modern life, and you can feel the old laws breathing beneath them. The bells that once marked prayer now live in our devices, announcing the hours with tones that summon us back to attention. The marketplace, once a square of barter and speech, has become a boundless cathedral of consumption, governed by unseen algorithms instead of priests. Confession has returned too, not whispered through latticework, but posted into feeds, offered to the faceless congregation of the crowd. Forgiveness comes not from absolution but from approval, not from God but from the collective gaze. We call this connection. We call it transparency. But the more we reveal, the less we remember what was meant to remain sacred. Privacy, once a sanctuary of thought, is now treated as secrecy, and secrecy as guilt. It is the same logic that once condemned heretics for thinking differently, only rewritten in the modern language of safety and trust. What was once excommunication is now deplatforming. What was once penance is now public apology. The methods are new, but the rhythm is ancient. Even morality has taken on familiar shapes. Every generation defines good and evil according to its fears, then builds its identity upon that division. We congratulate ourselves for abolishing barbaric punishments, yet we practice symbolic ones every day: exile through reputation, erasure through silence. The medieval world shunned those who broke sacred law. The modern world cancels those who break consensus. We forget that both actions spring from the same root: fear of disorder, fear that one dissenting voice might unravel the illusion of unity. Perhaps that is why the old laws always return. They are mirrors showing us what we have refused to see. When obedience hides inside virtue, when control disguises itself as compassion, when fear masquerades as logic, the reflection begins to sharpen. The language of our time is not divine law but policy, not sin but offense, not salvation but compliance. Yet beneath these words beats the same heart: the desire to belong to something certain, even if that certainty requires surrender. Our monuments have changed too. The cathedrals of stone have become towers of glass, glowing not with candlelight but with circuitry. At night, cities hum like living machines, their reflections merging with the stars. To stand among them is to feel both awe and insignificance, the same emotions once felt beneath vaulted ceilings centuries ago. The human heart has not changed, only its architecture has. We still seek transcendence, only now we call it connectivity. But progress is not the opposite of the past, it is its continuation. Every advance carries forward the same unspoken rule, that knowledge must serve order, and order must disguise itself as freedom. The forgotten counsels of the Middle Ages enforced conformity through faith. Today's institutions enforce it through data. Both claim to protect the world from chaos. Both rely on our willingness to forget that chaos is where creation begins. Yet amidst this repetition, something subtle is shifting. The awareness of pattern itself, the realization that we are repeating, changes the rhythm. To recognize the mirror is to begin breaking it. The reflection does not disappear, but it softens. and through its cracks, light begins to enter. Each person who pauses long enough to ask, "Why does this feel familiar?" becomes part of the remembering. We stand, once again, at the threshold between forgetting and awareness. The old laws whisper through new forms, the metrics we chase, the rituals we obey, the punishments we fear. But now we can hear them for what they are not. Divine decrees, not conspiracies, but echoes of a human need so ancient it has forgotten its own name. The need for certainty, the need to believe that meaning can be managed. And yet, there is something extraordinary in our recognition of this cycle. Unlike those before us, we are beginning to remember the forgetting. We see the patterns not as fate, but as habit. That simple awareness is revolution enough. The first step toward freedom is not rebellion, it is memory. To remember how we built our cages is to know where the door was placed. The mirror of now is both warning and invitation. It shows us that control will always wear the mask of virtue, and that progress will always carry the shadow of amnesia. But it also shows us that every reflection contains its opposite. Within the obedience of our systems lies the possibility of harmony. Within the machinery of routine lies the pulse of remembrance. If we learn to listen differently, to see the pattern without worshiping it, we may yet step beyond the cycle, not as victims of history, but as its witnesses. Perhaps the old laws were never meant to enslave us. Perhaps they were reminders, waiting patiently for each age to rediscover its balance. They return not to punish, but to guide, to tell us that every structure, even the invisible ones, is temporary, and that somewhere, beyond all systems, there is still the quiet space where law ends and understanding begins. There comes a moment, after all the searching, when even truth must rest. The questions that once felt urgent: who wrote the laws? Why were they erased? Will they return? Fade into stillness. History exhales. The noise of revelation softens into the sound beneath sound, the quiet hum of existence itself. This is the silence after the law, the pause between forgetting and remembering, where everything simply is. Imagine an ancient library, vast and half in shadow. The air smells of dust and candle wax. The shelves rise like pillars of a cathedral, each filled with volumes that have outlived their authors. Somewhere in the distance, a candle flickers. Its flame trembles, but it does not go out. The walls remember every word ever spoken within them, every vow, every erasure, every whisper of discovery. The silence here is not absence. It is presence too large for sound. Perhaps this is what the old scribes meant when they spoke of divine stillness, the state in which knowledge stops being a pursuit and becomes a memory. Humanity has always mistaken silence for emptiness, when in truth it is the space where meaning gathers. When the last law is forgotten, only memory remains to judge us not as punishment, but as reflection. What we have built, what we have destroyed, all return in that quiet moment, asking not for justification but understanding. The forgotten laws, the codex, the cycles, they were never about obedience. They were stories we told ourselves to remember the delicate balance between chaos and order. Each generation rewrote them in its own language: faith, logic, progress, freedom. Each believed it was building something new, but beneath the centuries, the message stayed the same. Do not forget who you are. Do not mistake the echo for the source. Now, standing at the edge of modernity's vast mirror, we see our reflection stretching backward through time. The stone towers of the past merge with the glass cities of the present, their shapes indistinguishable in the half-light. For a heartbeat, every era overlaps. The monk copying forbidden text, the mason carving hidden geometry, the scholar translating lost memory, the citizen scrolling through endless light. All are the same hand, writing the same sentence over and over, hoping one day to read it aloud and understand. What would happen if we finally did? If we remembered everything, not only our triumphs but our mistakes, not only our inventions but our intentions? Perhaps we would see that forgetting was never a flaw but a rhythm, that erasure is what allows renewal. The universe, too, forgets itself in cycles, stars collapsing, worlds reborn. Why should humanity be different? The silence after each collapse is not death, it is gestation. Memory sleeps so that creation can dream again. Somewhere, a voice once wrote, "The law returns until it is understood." Maybe understanding does not come from study, but from surrender. To sit in the quiet and listen not for words, but for the heartbeat beneath them. To recognize that every law, every system, every age of control was simply a reflection of our longing to belong to something larger. We feared the unknown, so we built rules. We feared freedom, so we built order. And in doing so, we circled closer to the truth that has no name. In the end, the great secret was never hidden at all. It was the silence between laws, the space where memory breathes. Every civilization touched it for an instant in music, in architecture, in love, and then moved on, mistaking the echo for the source. The keepers of the hidden law, the scribes of the codex, the architects of control, they were not conspirators, but custodians of a reminder that wisdom cannot be possessed, only remembered, and that remembrance requires forgetting first. If we listen now, in the quiet hours when the world has gone still, we may hear that same reminder echoing through the centuries, not as command, not as prophecy, but as invitation. The return is not a cycle imposed upon us. It is a door waiting to be opened from within. To walk through it is to accept the paradox, that every age of order leads to renewal, that every silence hums with creation, that the end of one law is always the beginning of another form of understanding. Perhaps that is why the candle still burns in the library, why the ink never fully dries. The story of humanity is not one of progress or decline, but of remembering and forgetting in equal measure. We are the dreamers who build cages and call them worlds, then wake to find the door already open. The laws vanish because they must. Their disappearance is what keeps us searching. Without that loss, there would be no longing, and without longing, no discovery. And so the silence is not final. It is a threshold. On one side lies everything we have learned. On the other, everything we are still meant to remember. The flame flickers once more, as if to say that the story continues beyond its telling. Somewhere, another scribe will begin again. Another civilization will build its laws, erase them, rediscover them. The spiral widens, and the echo becomes song. Close your eyes. Hear it, the faint rhythm of time breathing through itself. The world turning its pages, the light dimming, not in ending, but in rest. The silence after the law is not void, it is completion. It is the sound of the universe remembering itself through us. And as the last candle burns low, and the ink of all ages fades into one color, the voice that has spoken through centuries whispers a final truth, soft enough to be mistaken for wind. Nothing forgotten is ever lost. Nothing remembered is ever gone. Everything returns.